Hi class, welcome. Today we will be talking about chapter 12, which is titled Gender and Sexuality. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin and get too far along, we really need to discuss the differences between gender versus sex. We oftentimes use these two terms interchangeably, but they have entirely different meanings. So gender is actually related to a social dimension of being male or female. This is related to things like gender roles or gender stereotyping. This is different from sex, which is the biological aspect of being male or female. And so while we will be talking about the biological aspect as well, there's a lot of work that's related to gender as the social construct. And so we'll be talking about that too. So what determines our sex? This is given to us by a biological influence from our chromosomes, the 23rd pair, with the inheritance of either an X or a Y. And this comes from our father. So mothers will pass on an X, and then fathers will pass on either an X or a Y. And if you are XX, you would be biologically female. If you are XY, then you're biologically male. And this 23rd pair, this chromosome that we get, is related to our hormones. And we see differences in the hormones that we have based on our biological sex. So with estrogens, this would be seen in females and related to female sex characteristics. And then androgens, also known as testosterone, which is influencing the male genitalia and some of these male secondary characteristics that we see as we go through puberty. Your book then goes on to talk about different biological influences, but specifically some conditions that we see as a result of unusual levels of sex hormones. And these sex hormones these differences, these discrepancies can actually happen pretty early on in development. And so we've got congenital adrenal hyperplasia, androgen insensitive males, and pelvic field defect. And your book talks about these, and I also have an additional definition of these items in your PowerPoint as well that I've posted online. Okay, so now we can kind of start to segue a little bit into gender, right, which is that social construct. So if we take a look at the evolutionary perspective in psychology, this evolutionary view, the idea is that there are going to be different roles placed on males versus females, and that this is happening as a result of biological differences between males and females. And so some of the gender differences that we're noting are related to how males and females are actually different from one another. From a social perspective, or thinking about social influences, some of the differences we see between males and females may be due to our social experiences that we've had. So how a parent interacts with their child is different. Mothers and fathers, we know from research, actually tend to interact differently with their children. And children themselves are very much influenced by this gender curriculum that they experience. We also know that we learn a lot about who we are from our learning, our observation of other people. And this is related to observational learning. So children tend to pay attention to same-sex models They may view these models in television, in books, in magazines, and then sort of reproduce what it is that they have been looking at, right? So we talk about this as being part of that observational learning process. We also see cognitive influences in terms of that formation of gender. So your book goes on to talk about kind of this gender schema theory or cognitive development theory specifically for gender. And one of the things we see here is something called gender constancy. And so in order for children to have this gender typing, they have to think of themselves as either being boys or girls. But they have to consistently know that, right? They have to consistently know that there's a difference between that boy and that girl, and that they are a boy or girl always, that doesn't change. Once that sort of consistency has been reached, children tend to prefer activities and objects and attitudes that line up very closely with that label, right? So either being, male or female. Gender schema theory is something that sort of emerges gradually. And this is heavily influenced by our culture. Gender-typed behavior, though, can occur before a child has developed gender constancy. And gender schemas are really what's fueling this gender typing. So let's take a look. This might be a decision tree that a young child might go through. All right, so here on top we've got a truck. The child thinks, well, who is this for? It's for a boy. Well, I'm a girl, so, it's not for me, and therefore I'm going to forget it. Now I look at this and I see a doll. I think to myself, well, who is this for? Oh, girls typically play with dolls. And so this relates then to my gender identity. Or I think about my gender identity, and here I think, yeah, I'm a girl. And so I think, wow, that doll is for me. It's something that I play with. Therefore, I might approach that. I might gather more information on that. I might see other people playing with those dolls, and those people look very similar to me, right? And you start to remember that. And so you start to take information and think about as a whole how that relates to you. And then when information doesn't fit into that ideal, we forget it, right? If it does fit in, we go ahead and we keep it. But by doing this, we also tend to gender stereotype as well. And this is kind of this general impression for how we believe males and females should behave, how they should act. And that very heavily influences how we interact with those around us. It also relates to, this traditional idea of masculinity and femininity, which I think on its own is a really, really neat conversation to have. So males and females are thought of to be different, right? And to act differently. In fact, we believe that women tend to have more expressive traits, while men have more of these instrumental traits. Males are interacting with others to sort of get things done, while our females are, trying to befriend and really form connections. This is very much a stereotype, but it's also heavily influenced by the imagery that we see and the messages that we continue to pass on and provide to children. Developmentally, gender stereotyping is actually present in 2-year-olds. So 2-year-olds are engaging in this behavior. And this varies dramatically based on culture. And so, again, this opens up a really cool conversation to have, which is, how much of who we are is dictated by the environment, or who we are in terms of that gender is dictated by our environment, by the imagery that we see, the ways in which people treat us, even if we don't register that difference. So think on that, and I'd love to chat with you if you would like. All right. So one of the things to keep in mind is that fundamentally males and females are different, right? From a physical perspective, males and females are different. But we also see gender differences. And the gender differences are social constructs, right? So if we take a look at kind of physical differences in terms of kind of this sex, right? The differences in sex. Female brains tend to be smaller, but they tend to have more folds. The area of the brain involved in sexual behavior, the hypothalamus, is larger in men than it is in women. Areas related to sort of visuospatial skills tend to be larger in males. Areas of the brain involved in emotional expression tend to be larger in females. So these are physical differences that we see. But these physical differences are exacerbated by society and culture. And then we start to feel as though males and females not only are biologically different, but then we start to look at kind of these gender differences. And maybe how we explain behaviors differs, or the expectations we have differ. So how does gender develop throughout the lifespan? Well, children are really forming a lot of ideas about what sexes are like, and they're doing this pretty early on. So from about 1.5 to 3 years of age, we're starting to think about these differences, and we're noting them, and we're kind of keeping tabs on that. Boys in general tend to receive more intense gender socialization. This is known as that kind of boy code, right? So kind of this idea of a little boy falls down. Well, boys, get up, boys don't cry. This can be problematic in lots of ways. And in fact, a good bit of research suggests to us that boys in general could benefit greatly from increased socialization, that increased modeling of expressing themselves and regulating the feelings that they have. Children in general show a pretty clear preference for same-sex peers. So from a pretty young age, there is a preference to sort of hang out with children who are from a sex perspective, similar, right? So boys tending to have a preference to hang out with boys, and girls tending to hang out more so with girls. As we transition into adolescence, there's other big changes that are occurring. One of the biggest is going through puberty. And so during this time, we see something called a gender intensification. And here we may have a little bit actually more fluidity when we're in childhood on what genders look like, what boys could do, what girls can do. But as we get to adolescence, we have this intensification. It's almost like this doubling down, if you will. And it's also faced with a pretty extreme, I don't necessarily want to say ostracism, but almost kind of delineating or pushing away things that don't match with that gender ideal. And kids will do this to each other, right? So, while a tomboy might be generally acceptable during childhood, you're going through puberty, well, why don't you like girl things? That's overly masculine, right? And vice versa. So a little boy, that's quite feminine, what you're doing or what you're wearing. Why would you wear that pink shirt, or whatever it is? And so we do see this gender intensification as we get into adolescence. As we move into adulthood and aging, an interesting sort of trend that we see is differences in communication styles between males and females. So what we see is, you may have heard of this, of a rapport talk versus report talk. So rapport talk is much more related to women. This idea of kind of, interacting with somebody and using conversation as a way to create a connection, versus kind of that report talk where this might be a style typically preferred by men, which is, I'm going to give you information, right? So you've got two people, how was your day? The woman might be giving you sort of a lot of extra information, while a male might just say, this, and this is what happened. Or I had 4 meetings today, and, they were productive, it was great, so on and so forth. The intention is I'm providing you with information. When we think about aging, we talk a lot about how masculinity and femininity come into existence as we're younger, and it's a really great area to focus. But we also see kind of these shifts and transitions to this masculinity and femininity on the back end as well. And so there is often a decreased masculinity in most men as they get into sort of later stages of their life. While not as common, we also may see potentially some decreased femininity in some women. This, however, these sort of trends that we see are definitely impacted by cohort effects, so experiences of individuals, during a specific time. While we often have pretty positive connotations with men aging, maybe in terms of intelligence, even physically, right? We talk about sort of salt and peppered hair as being really, really attractive. Our youth-obsessed culture really doesn't value that getting older, particularly in women. And so what we see is that older women tend to face double jeopardy, so sort of ageism and sexism. Minority women tend to be even worse off, facing what we call triple jeopardy, which is ageism, sexism, and racism. Okay, so this gives us kind of a nice sort of picture of this chapter. Your PowerPoint notes go in much greater detail with each of these slides. I also encourage you to take a look at your book readings, and these can provide you with additional examples. As always, if you have any questions over your material, please do not hesitate to reach out to me and ask me any questions. All right, I hope you have a great day. Bye.